Good afternoon and welcome to Associated University, a group that is designed to provide supply chain management professionals with access to information on practical solutions concerning the industry's current hot topics. Today we will be discussing how to optimize your warehouse space to increase efficiency and maximize ROI. Your presenter today is McDonald. Alan has over 20 years of experience in supply chain and has served in a variety of roles from sales through consulting and engineering to project installation and startup. He is currently part of the Peach State Integrated Technologies team and serves as their Senior Director of Concepting and Engineering. Alan has performed work for companies of all sizes in many different industries. He utilizes his strong background in solutions development to assist customers in projects involving logistics strategy decisions in order to help them improve their operations and meet their overall objectives for performance and productivity. We have scheduled 15 minutes at the end of this presentation to answer any questions you may have. If you have a question during the course of the presentation or at the end, simply type it in the right-hand side of your screen in the question box. Following this webinar, we will also be providing all attendees with a copy of this presentation. And now I'm happy to pass it over to Alan to get us started.
Thanks, Sherry. First thing I want to do is thank everyone. Welcome them to this session of Associated University, and thank you for your time today. I want to try to make the best use of everyone's time. Like Sherry mentioned, we're going to have a time for answering questions at the end, so go ahead and type those in as we're going through and as you think of them, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. First thing I want to do is go through what we're going to discuss today. And as a recovering salesperson, I correctly identified these problems as opportunities. So we've got recognizing the opportunity, everything measuring, reducing, managing, and then we'll have our Q&A session. Really, the opportunity we have here is the opportunity to make the most out of the space we currently have. And it could also be a chance to tell our company how much space we need or would like to have in the future. Sometimes we don't have that possibility, but hopefully we do occasionally. The problem is, if we don't use a justifiable or a defendable method for letting them know how much space we're going to need, it becomes our opinion. And that may or may not be enough to get what we need in terms of finances or other things from our organization. So the last part, the managing the opportunity, is we're going to cover a few of some of the speed bumps we may run into down the road that we probably need to be aware of. So with that said, the first thing we're going to talk about is recognizing the opportunity. I want to start by defining the perfect order. I didn't create this definition, so if it looks familiar, it's not because I created it. But this is really the definition of a perfect order is the right quantity of the right product delivered to the right customer at the right time. There are really three parts to that I want to talk about. The part that says delivered to the right customer is obviously a critical part, but the majority of the time these days I would argue that's controlled electronically. So we don't have as much importance or as much of a role in that as we do in the first and last part of that. The first part is really the right quantity of the right product. And that one is mostly inventory driven. There's obviously an order accuracy portion of that we need to pick the correct product, but having the right quantity of the right product on hand is important, because if we don't do that, then we've just failed the first part of our perfect order. The second part, or the last part, at the right time, that's really a resource-driven portion of this thing. So the first half is really space-driven, I guess, if you will, in terms of it being an inventory issue. The second half is a resource issue. And those resources require space and a place to exist, and that kind of flies in direct conflict with the space we want to dedicate to our inventory. So some of the things you're going to hear me talk about today are kind of where we draw that line between the space available for our product and inventory and the space available for our resources, our personnel, or our processes. A deficiency in either one of them obviously could cause us problems, and it will cause us to fail this perfect order qualification. So if we look at a typical facility, I will say, it's got several different areas in it. Now, your facility might not have all of these areas, but probably has several of them. And fortunately or unfortunately, our facilities can't expand and contract like this cloud can, so that we probably have fixed walls. And each one of these takes up a fixed amount of room, especially office space, things that have walls. Part of the issue that we run into, and what we're going to discuss today, is there are a lot of relationships, and our resources have to travel to, from, and between all of these areas every single day, and probably multiple trips per day. It'd be nice if we could just put all these areas right next to the area that they have the most affinity for, but that's not exactly how things flow, obviously. They all have affinities for multiple other areas, and it could depend on the time of day or the type of resource, how strong that affinity is to be closer to another area. So it could be they have several trips between those areas. It could just be that we have a lot of dollars of product going between those areas. We really need to determine, if we're going to try to lay out our facility this way, what the important metric is that we want to use. If it's trips and that's what's costing us the most money, then that's how we need to lay out our facility. Most people, for example, want their employees to walk in the door and have their work ready for them immediately and be right in the area where their work's going to start. And that makes sense on one level, but on another level, that might be the least utilized path they make all day. They're probably going to walk at the beginning of the day. They may, at lunch, walk out the door and then come back in, and then at the end of the day, they're going to leave. So they're going to make that path 4 times a day. It doesn't necessarily make sense to make that the easiest path for them when it's so underutilized typically. So this is one way we recognize our opportunity is we draw these affinity maps, and we kind of pay attention to what areas need to or should be close to one another. Other things we can recognize as opportunities. First one here is if we're greater than 85% full. And I picked that 85% number because that's usually a pretty common metric. If you're over 85% full, then you're probably looking for locations to put things away, and you're spending time looking for locations, available locations, or looking for product that you shouldn't have to spend time looking for. Now, when I say 85% full, there's a difference. I've walked into facilities many times that said they were 85% full, but their cube utilization was probably under 50%. A lot of times people measure this fullness with their location utilization, which is probably accurate depending on how they operate their facility. But if you have one unit in a location, sometimes that location is full according to your software. So you may be 85% full, but still have all kinds of space available or open space in your facility. You may be very low on your cube utilization. Unfortunately, the location is what we need to use, and so that's how we typically measure that. Another thing that might present itself as an opportunity, if we have congestion in our facility, could be in various areas, even if it's only at specific times of the day. Congestion for limited amounts of time might be acceptable. Really depends on your tolerance and the cost of removing it. It also kind of depends on what safety issues might be caused by the congestion. Congestion, obviously, we're going to have a bottleneck at somewhere in our facility. The issue is if that is limiting our productivity, then we probably need to address it. One way people address that a lot of times is staging space, where they will provide an area for products to be brought forward and staged in between 2 processes. Staging space is good for imbalanced processes, but sometimes it can hide the problem as well. So it can present a solution to the problem. It can also hide a problem of having 2 imbalanced processes or having too much congestion. So while I'm not promoting that we get rid of staging space, I would suggest we should limit it and pay attention to it so that we know how to properly balance our resources throughout the course of the day. Another opportunity, consistent missing of deadlines with no ability to add throughput, even if this is temporarily in the course of a day. A lot of times we staff our facilities so that we can achieve the maximum number of lines, SKUs, units, however we measure ourselves, throughout the course of a day. The issue is that peak only occurs for a short period of time, but we can't staff up and down resource-wise relative to that, so we have to staff at a day level, maybe even at a week level. So many times we will accept missing of some deadlines or missing shipping orders out as a result of that. If we're consistently doing that, then we probably have an opportunity to better utilize our space. And I would argue that it probably is a space issue in most events. Starting on the bottom half of the page, we really talk about kind of the other problem. Sometimes we have too little space. Sometimes we have too much. If we're less than 50% full, then we probably have too much space. And while that some of you may laugh about that and say that's not usually a problem, it can be a problem if you're traveling too far to get to SKUs or traveling too far to pick items. That's when it really manifests itself as a problem. So it's a productivity problem. If your product storage height doesn't match your facility height, walk into facilities a lot of times and they'll have this gorgeous 30 or 32-foot clear facility, and then they'll have 2 pallets stacked on the floor with about 20 feet of open space above them. You know, the idea of building a building that size is that we maximize the use of that square foot all the way up to the roof. If we don't do that, then we have an opportunity to increase our utilization of that space. Next item, large spikes in inventory or order volumes. If we have no change, but especially if we have no change in the amount of space we use. So if we have a very seasonal business, then we probably should, if at all possible, vary the amount of space we use throughout the course of that season so that when our inventory is highest, we have the capability to expand into a space, or when our order volumes are highest, we can expand our processing areas into that space. But when they go back down, we can contract back into a more feasible space productivity-wise. If we don't change the amount of space we use and we have a seasonal type of inventory or order volume, then we probably have an opportunity to save ourselves some space there. The last one I have listed here is high real estate costs. That obviously having the cost of real estate affects our justification for space. If we have high real estate costs, then it generally causes us to have to do something within the 4 walls. The lower the cost of land around our property is, or the easier that we can acquire that property, the easier it is for us to just expand out. So really what we're looking for is unutilized or underutilized resources in terms of recognizing these opportunities. What I'd like to do now is I've got a poll question, and I'd like for everyone to answer it if you could, or if you have an opinion. The question really is, what type of space issues is your company experiencing more of? And I've got multiple choice here. Is it inventory or storage space? Or is it congestion or processing space? Or is it both? So if you could, go ahead and populate those. I just want to get a feel for what kind of space issues people are seeing. I have my own opinion of what it might be, but looks like right now both is kind of leading the voting from what I'm seeing real time. So looks like most of our voting is probably complete. All right, I'll go ahead and close that poll. So looks like what we had was about 63% said both. They were having both issues. So that was the leader. I kind of guessed that might be the leader. The most likely second candidate was I kind of had an idea that might be it too. Inventory and storage space. That's usually the most recognizable problem that we have. It's more difficult to recognize congestion or processing space issues because our people generally try to work their way through that, and whether they're successful or not, they try to work their way through it and don't let us know that. All right, thanks. I appreciate everyone's participation in that. So measuring the opportunity is the next thing we want to talk about. We talked a little bit about how we recognize these opportunities. How do we measure these opportunities? First thing we want to know is, why do we even want to measure these opportunities? Which is probably a good question, and the one I always get from my son whenever I ask him to do something. Why? 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 First thing is, we want to know when we're syncing. This usually isn't too hard to figure out. In fact, if we listen, people will tell us as soon as we start to sync. So it's usually easy to get feedback on this one. When we aren't getting orders out or getting shipments out, people tend to let us know right away. And I like to tell people that the best distribution center is kind of like a good umpire in a baseball game. No one knows that they exist. As soon as, if you've ever watched a baseball game where there's been a controversial call, as soon as people know the umpire's name, then it's usually a bad thing for him. As soon as people know that our distribution center exists or that they're having issues, it usually doesn't spell good things for us. So next thing we want to figure out why we want to measure is so we can project when we're going to be syncing. It's nice to know when we are syncing. Well, it's nice to know that we're syncing, but we'd really rather know when we're going to be syncing in the future. So the important part is to know when we can expect to start running into problems, and also in what areas. It's great to know when we're going to start running into problems overall in our facility or in our operation, but if we can know specifically what areas based on what work we have to get done that day, then we can hopefully take some preemptive action and counteract that. That's how we really optimize our space. We look for the areas that are going to be the bottleneck, and then figure out ahead of time how to ease that bottleneck or what action we need to take to get around that bottleneck. So the next thing, do I need more space or less? This may seem like an obvious answer, but it's not always. For example, if you have a picking standard or a standard rate in your facility for your folks that you count on them operating, at which you count on them operating, does that account for the amount of distance they have to travel to get to their next function? If it does not, then they are probably traveling too far, because you're not taking that into account, and so things will continue to get spread out farther and farther, and it's going to hurt their productivity eventually, but you're probably having them travel too far if you're not accounting for that. What we really need to do is account for that, so then we would know we need to take up less space, actually. A lot of times the solution isn't adding space. The solution is being more efficient with the space we have and compressing our operation. The next thing is sometimes we just need help with justifying what space we're looking for. What's the best use of that extra space that I have? All of a sudden I had an operation move out of my facility or tenant move out of my facility, and I've got this extra space. What's the best use for that? You know, are we in more dire straits in our storage capacity or in our throughput capacity? If we're not measuring that opportunity or measuring where we are relative to our capacities on those, then we're not going to have any idea what the best thing to use that space for is. What you're likely to discover in general, operations that are individual-based or based around a single person are more likely to require a smaller space to become more efficient, because we want everything within that person's reach. Operations that are team-based are probably going to desire more space, just because we don't want people turning into each other or operating on top of one another. In general, individual tasks, we want to compress those to make them more efficient. Group tasks, we probably want to spread them out to an extent to make them more efficient. Helping with the justification and measuring these opportunities, somehow measuring this is a great way to show our upper level management why we need additional space. How do we measure these opportunities? First question I ask people whenever I go into their facility is, what's the capacity of your facility? And in general, the answer I get is, oh, it's this many pallets, or it's this many SKUs, or it's X dollars of inventory. Those are storage capacity answers, and those are all readily available, and probably most of us are well aware what the storage capacity of our facility is. We can use pallets, SKUs, dollars. In general, I would tell you things like dollars are a little tougher to get an accurate measurement on, because obviously the market controls the price of our goods, and that can increase or decrease what our capacity is without us actually taking any steps. So it needs to be something that gets rid of the background noise. Pallets is sometimes a good one, but if we have half pallets, those can count as pallets. So we just really need to figure out what the best measure is in terms of our capacity. The question I really ask people, though, after I get their storage capacity answer is, what's your throughput capacity? And I don't mean what's the maximum number of units or orders or whatever you ship in a day. What I'm looking for is, what's the maximum number that you can ship in theory? What is that number? And maybe it's lines, maybe it's units, maybe it's orders, maybe it's trucks. Whatever unit of measure, whatever metric you use, what's the maximum number of those you can theoretically get out of your facility? So, and I say facility through this could, I guess, easily probably be distribution network as well, but in general, I'm concentrating on facilities. So our throughput capacity a lot of times is something people don't know, they don't even think about until they run into a capacity issue. We really need to make sure it's based on definable metrics. For us, we typically use MOST analyses, which is Maynard operating system. It's a good standards. It's a good way of measuring how productive someone should be in an operation, and it's a pretty commonly accepted measure. Maybe you have your own standards, but you should be able to put those together and come up with what is your throughput capacity. And in reality, once we know that, then the rest of this becomes a little bit easier. Like, what are the projected requirements for our facility? We can usually get this, a lot of times it's going to be in sales dollars, but most times people know based on projections what we are going to have to, what metrics we're going to have to operate at to be successful. I would argue this is more, it's more important to have this on an area by area basis than just for the whole facility in general. The other thing we really need to make sure of is that we take space into our calculation, because that's what we're looking for here, and we should be able to relate all of this stuff to space. So it becomes a density issue. I would almost call it a productivity density. And whether it's storage density or throughput density, we can at least measure where we are and know which one of those we have a bigger problem in, which one we're closer to our capacity or closer to our projections with our capacity on. So if we have space available, which one do we need to add? Do we need to add storage capacity or throughput capacity? And if we do this on an area by area basis, it really shows us in our facility where our bottlenecks are going to be when we get into the future and our business grows. All right, so next, where do we measure this? Where do we see these opportunities? The easy answer is everywhere in the facility, but in general, the most obvious answer is our secondary storage or our bigger products. This is where 80% of our products that make up 20% of our activity probably reside. It's probably our reserve storage for our primary SKUs. While the activity is lower in this area and it's lower on these items, it still takes a significant amount of time to pick because we have a lot larger travel distances. So if we can do anything to improve our productivity density in these areas, in the secondary storage or bigger products, it can make a big difference. Next one is our shipping or receiving docks. These are probably the most commonly underutilized areas of cube in the facility. Many times the shipping areas will have a mezzanine that houses a sorter, but this is more of a maintenance platform and really doesn't hold any other operation. So it still provides us with a lot of opportunity in that area to use that overhead space. Also, our receiving areas are typically not utilized in the overhead space, so this is a really good opportunity. In addition to this, both of these areas, the mobile equipment that accesses these areas has to fit into the trailers, so it's typically short enough it could fit under a mezzanine anyway. So really, even if we just put product over these areas, we don't want it to be fast-moving product, but we can at least utilize some of that space, even if we can't put mezzanines over the top and put processing areas there. Next bullet I have is put away or picking strategy. A lot of WMSs are set up to get things put away as quickly and efficiently as possible, which generally means we take a half pallet of something and put it in an open location. Well, that's not the best use of our space. And again, here's where we see the balance between space constraints and productivity constraints. If we were to take that half pallet of goods and put it on an order picker and consolidate it with a pallet of like SKU in an existing location, then we've just freed up a location. But we still have another location available, and we're better utilizing our cube at that point. Now, you obviously pay for that on the productivity because your operator is touching every one of those cartons, but you're definitely making the best use of your space in that situation. Next bullet is processing areas. Looking at these processing areas, most times we have operators in these areas. As long as our operators have something over their head, they generally aren't too concerned. In fact, many times they don't like having a 30-foot clear roof above them. It just provides too much space above them. But fortunately, as human beings, we can operate in a given overhead space. So assuming we have enough lighting underneath it, above that, we can put another processing area or some additional storage or things like that. But a lot of times, these processing areas will walk into a facility and they'll have lights dropped hanging from the ceiling all the way down at about a 12-foot elevation just so they can better light an area. If we just put a mezzanine over that, then we've got support for our lights and sprinklers and things, and we can do something with that additional floor space we got. The last bullet here is really the interaction between various areas. This can be man-machine interfaces, it could be person-to-person interfaces, or it could be a combination, equipment-person, person-equipment, things like that. Really, the way we design that interaction area can either cause congestion or relieve congestion. And if we leave too much space for it, we're not being efficient. For example, maybe an operator is doing something with totes on a cart, and when they're done with it, they stage them for the next operator. Well, if they just stage them in a huge group and don't put aisles between all of them, and the downstream operator needs to get to a specific cart, it's going to be very inefficient. Good use of space, bad use of productivity again in that case. And when I say interactions between these areas, that includes conveyor. That really is a whip storage area for us. That's why we have this accumulation conveyor in our facilities. And I guess to give you an example of a utilization of an area, if you think about it, if you have a sortation system that's capable of sorting 100 cases a minute, but for the first 2 minutes that it's operating, it gets 0 cases fed to it, and then in the third minute, it gets 300 cases fed to it, the productivity of that sorter is only about 33 cases a minute because it's only sorted 100 in the 3 minutes it was operational. So just looking at the capacity of an area isn't enough for us to know whether it's going to be big enough for us. We also need to look at how we're feeding that area and what rate things are coming into that area at so that we can better size it. We may have peaks and valleys in that instead of it being a steady stream in and out. So we talked about recognizing the opportunity. We talked about measuring the opportunity. Let's try to reduce the opportunity or reduce the amount of space. Let's look at some ways we can do that. And really, the big question is, do we add or remove capacity based on our current metrics or the current way we do things, or should we invest in technology or a different type of storage to move the curve? So then we just shift our entire operation to a more efficient curve. That's the question that we're trying to come up with the answer for. The best way to reduce space in a facility is reduction in aisle spacing. If we look even in good facilities, aisles are probably 10 to 15% of the space in the facility. If we can reduce that amount of space consumed by those aisles, then obviously we're saving space. Some ways to do that we can see listed here. Obviously we've got bulk storage. You know, the original and best way to store things was in a pile. This is at least a little more organized method of that. If we stack pallets on top of one another on the floor, we can see in this facility it's probably the best way to store things. We're not going to gain any more storage by going any higher because the roof is so close. So there may be areas of our facility where this is a good option for us. Things we need to watch out for, things like humidity and uneven stacks can obviously haunt us if we're trying to stack pallets on top of one another. I've seen humidity have such an effect that it'll cause things to be imbalanced and fall. So we need to watch out for that. Movable shelving. So you can see the concept here in a regular shelving bay or set of bays. We would have multiple aisles. We'd have aisles in between each row of shelving. In this case, we only have one aisle, and it moves around. You see these in libraries quite a bit. And the reason you see them in libraries is because their products move so slowly. So the concept here, especially for movable shelving, is we want to put our slower moving products in here because they're more difficult to access. Something else we need to keep in mind when we're talking about these things is the selectivity of the product. So if we had an aisle down between each one of these rows of shelving, then every one of our products is accessible or is selectable at any time. If we have to move the aisle, then a limited number of our items are selectable. So we really need to pay attention to that as well in these different solutions. Is, are we blocking off items or making it challenging to get to specific items because we're trading that off for this space savings? So that selectivity becomes a kind of a big concern too. Next method, narrow aisle or very narrow aisle storage, rack storage. This is a great tool. You can see a demonstration of it here, and a lot of times there'll be a wire running down the middle of the aisle to guide the equipment, or some rails on either side to keep the equipment centered in that aisle. But you can see as the operator goes down the aisle, they've got product on each side of them, so it's very efficient in terms of storage. And obviously you're minimizing that aisle space as much as possible. Things to watch out for with this, you may have to invest in a different type of mobile equipment. You also, if your racks go very high, you will have to make sure that your floor is flat enough that it can handle this type of storage, because if the racks, there's any unevenness in the floor, it can cause that aisle spacing to change at the very top of those racks. Double deep rack, again, this just takes some of our aisle spacing out. You can see there are products. The rack on the left side here is accessible from the left side. So we've got 2 bays accessible on this side and 2 from the other side. Obviously, you want to put the same SKU behind one another or something that's very slow moving, because if we don't, then it can cause us some issues with our selectivity again, and we'll trap items in there. The next item I've got showing now is pallet flow. This is an excellent way to store a lot of a fast-moving product. You can see it's accessible from both sides. The truck on the left is charging or loading the system. The truck on the right is taking things out of the system. So we can fill it at the same time we're emptying it. It's very efficient. The product just rides on rails all the way from one end to the other. The thing that we need to watch out for with this is Obviously, depending on how deep we make this, we want to make sure we have a lot of inventory of each item so that we can fill this and we're not wasting the space with just having dead air in there. Next thing is pushback rack. This is a similar concept to pallet flow, except it's closed on the back, so we can put it against the wall. We've got carts that the product rides on. Things we need to watch out for with this is the first product we put in is not going to be, it's going to be the last one we take out. So it doesn't work well for FIFO requirements. Last thing, and probably most of us have tried to utilize this, but tunnels in our rack. This is a really good way to use that overhead space that would normally just be wide open all the way up to the ceiling. The one thing that hopefully you haven't experienced with this, but you might, is if the operators don't put their mask down on their equipment, then obviously that can cause some problems. So we need to make sure that we safeguard against that somehow. Other ways, we can reduce our staging space. We talked about this a little bit. So we really want to minimize that to the point where we can see when there's a problem, when it's filling up, and we can appropriately assign resources to address that. Stacking personnel and processing areas, we talked about that. Mezzanines are a great tool for that. The last few things we have here are automation or goods-to-man systems. Many of these aren't as effective on space savings, but they are on productivity because your operators are stationary and the items are being brought to them for the most part. So I'm not going to cover every one of those in depth, but obviously those tools have varying levels of technology. Some of them have separate feed and discharge points so we can replenish goods as well as pick them at the same time. They all have different, obviously different velocities they operate at and different capacities. So also we can reduce inventory. All those evil inventory managers that are watching this are probably cursing me right now, but you know, if there's dead inventory in our facility, it's not going anywhere. We at least, if we don't ask the question about where it can go, then it's never going to go anywhere. So we at least need to ask, hey, is there something we can do with this? Can we put it into, can we put it in off-site storage? Can we put it somewhere? If it's never going to move, we need to find a more efficient way to use that space. Other things like software-assisted solutions. There are a variety of tools we can use, software-related, to help us with our space savings. Again, we're probably paying a little bit of a price in our productivity and our throughput, but it will help us save space. The biggest thing that I would point out on this is the right sizing locations. If we have the correct size of location or the correct size in our software, then it will help us greatly in creating the right size location for our items. All right, last point. Managing the opportunity. What are some things that are going to maybe cause us problems we need to watch out for? Specialty storage types, things like vaults, refrigerators, aerosols, these have a fixed space that they consume. We can't really rearrange those very easily. So those are things we just need to do the best we can with those and arrange around them. We need to pay attention to what needs to go in them and how many moves need to go in and out, but sometimes there's just things we can't do with those. Corporate decisions, obviously we've all run into the answer no before. That happens. The decision may be, hey, wait, we don't have the funds yet, but wait. That is very possible. We need to come up with ways that maybe are more justifiable or do a better job of measuring so that we can get there. Inventory management, we talked about that. I'm not going to belabor that point, but I will say, again, if you don't ask the question, the answer is always no. And then the last two are kind of related. How long is the issue going to last? Is this a long-term problem for us, or is it a temporary problem? And if it's a long-term problem, is it going to cost us more to make the change than it is by not changing at all? So these are things that if we're measuring, then we have the capability to defend ourselves, or at least have a defendable premise for justifying our solution, justifying our need for these dollars. So we just really need to pay attention to how long the duration is going to be and how much it costs to change versus the cost of not changing, what it's costing us in our inefficiencies. The question really shouldn't be, can we be any more space efficient? We can always be more space efficient. The question should be, what is keeping us from being more space efficient? It may be a dollars issue, it may be an equipment issue, but at least if we're able to recognize those opportunities and measure them, then we have the answer in front of us. That way we can present it to others and we know what it's costing us in our inefficiency.
And that brings us to the closing of this session. Thank you so much, Alan, for presenting this material, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope you found this information to be relevant and valuable to your organization. Thank you, and have a great day.